In this presentation, you're going to learn about the stages of clay, and you'll be experiencing all these different stages of clay at some point with our projects. Now, the learning objectives for this presentation is to articulate the vocabulary and terms used in ceramics in order to explain how clay goes through various stages as it is transformed into a finished product. And your mastery check is going to focus on this objective. Now, when I give you clay, it is not this stage. I give you clay when it is stage number 1. But technically, if we take clay and add a lot of water, we end up with this stage called slip. That is why I put 2 asterisk marks next to it. So slip is clay plus water. We use slip to join clay parts together. It's part of the building process when working with ceramics. I will be giving you your own slip. You do not need to make your own, though you can always add more clay to the slip that I give you in class. And remember, slip is one of the processes of ceramics because we use it when we're scoring and slipping, thus attaching pieces of clay together. Now, if we let the slip dries out, then we end up with the first stage of clay, which we call plastic. This is clay that is soft, it's pliable, it's easy to work with. This is often when students say, I need new clay. What I know what they mean is they need clay straight from the bag. The clay is workable. It's fresh clay from the bag. That's a great way to think about it. Now, your recycled clay is also plastic because, again, it is workable. It's easy to wedge. You can form things with it. This is also the best time to create organic forms such as spheres and pinch pots and coils and just different types of organic forms because it is easy, it's malleable to work with. Now, if we take this plastic staged clay and we let the clay dry a little bit more, then it becomes number 2, leather hard. This is a very important stage. Sometimes we want our clay to be leather hard. The clay has dried slightly, making it stiffer and allowing it to support its own weight. The clay still has some moisture though. It's not completely dried out. This is the best time for carving the clay and using clay to build boxes. So later on when we learn to work with slabs, you'll hear me say, make sure your clay is leather hard before you start constructing with it. Now, if we allow the clay to dry out completely, all the water evaporates, then it becomes stage number 3, which we call bone dry clay. Now, this is clay that has completely dried out. All traces of moisture are gone. All water is gone. However, the clay is extremely fragile, but it's ready to be fired in the kiln. So you guys have to put a little bit of trust in me as your teacher to make sure your clay dries out properly and that I am careful with it when I put it in the kiln. Now, you cannot attach pieces of clay together. You cannot attach bone dry clay and plastic clay together. So the reason why is because they have different levels of moisture. Bone dry clay has very little moisture, very little water content, while plastic staged clay has a lot more moisture. You really can't attach those 2 different stages of clay together because there's just not enough water to keep it together. Bone dry clay is the most fragile stage of clay. And this is a good visualization because when clay is leather hard, it looks typically a little darker because of the water content. And then when we let the clay go to bone dry, you see it's a lot lighter in color. So this is a good way to tell if your clay has dried to bone dry. Now, if we are silly and we accidentally drop our bone dry clay project, this is what happens. Oh, the sadness. So if we're not firing the clay, okay, the clay has gone to bone dry, I don't plan on saving the project. You can recycle it by taking the dried out clay, adding a lot of water, turning it into slip, let it dry into plastic, and boom, you have workable clay. However, if you do plan to fire your bone dry clay, we're going to be putting it in the kiln. And this is for the first firing. What happens in the kiln is there is a chemical change due to the high degree of heat. So it actually the chemistry of the clay actually changes. So the first firing is what we call a bisque fire. This is where all the water is removed from the clay. And you can see actually there's a bit of a size change that happens. So what happens during the first firing is the clay is heated up to 1900 degrees or even more, depending on the clay. The clay shrinks because the moisture is leaving. Takes about 24 hours to fire. Why 24 hours? Well, think of your oven at home. You have to let your oven heat up to a certain temperature, then you can use the oven, and then when you're done, you have to let the oven cool down, for safety reasons. It's the same thing for our kilns at school. So what happens is the particles in the clay fuse together as water evaporates from the clay. And we have to let the kiln cool off for another 24 hours. So after that bisque firing is done, we now have stage number 4, bisque wear. So the clay has fused together, it's become permanent. We can't recycle it. Yes, we can break the project, but we can't take the clay and reuse it to actually build something new. It's gone through a totally different process. It's no longer usable. But we can glaze it or paint it, and you'll be learning how to glaze and paint your projects in this class. Now, the surface of bisqueware is very porous. And here's an up-close image of some clay. You can see how porous that surface is. That means water can get into it. So this is why it's good to actually finish your projects with paint or glaze. Now, if we paint your bisqueware, you're done. That's it. You're done. But if we decide to glaze it, we need to fire it again. So we're going to put it in the kiln. And what happens in the kiln is it fires up again and it melts the glaze. The heat causes the glaze to melt. It adheres to the surface. So we call that a glaze fire. And after we pull that clay out of the kiln, we have stage number 5, which is called glaze wear. And so it's been fired in the kiln for a second time. This is our final ceramic project. You're done. Ta-da! It's nice and shiny and it's colorful. And the glaze becomes a glass, which helps adhere it to the surface. And that's it. So you'll be learning how to glaze your projects at some point in this class. Good to know is if the glaze is food safe, we can eat and drink out of it. I will let you know if your glaze is or is not food safe.